Hey mama, are you tired of feeling stressed and overwhelmed trying to grow your online business with your babies at home? You desire more flexibility in your day, allowing you to pour into your family, yourself, and your business without running yourself into the ground. Mama, you can build your dream business and do it in a way that fits your current season of life. And I'm going to show you exactly how. Welcome to the Mama Turned Mompreneur podcast. I'm your host, Andria Singletary, daughter of the king, wife, mama of two, and life and business coach for mompreneurs. On this podcast, you will learn business strategies made for mamas just like you, who desire to be successful CEOs and fully present mamas without stress or overwhelm. So whether you're an entrepreneur who transitioned to a mompreneur or a mama turned mompreneur, I am here to support you. So grab your coffee, notebook, and pen, put in those earbuds, and let's dig in. Hey, mama. So one question that often comes up for podcasters is how to name podcast episodes, or, what's the best way to name your podcast episodes so that people will actually click and listen? The reality is that if your podcast episode titles aren't piquing a potential listener's interest, they are not going to click the link to listen, which you do not want as a podcast host. You put your time and energy into planning, recording, and producing your podcast content. And so if no one listens or not many people are listening, you're left feeling frustrated and questioning, if podcasting is even worth it. So if you've seen like a decline in your podcast listens, or you're stuck at a certain number in your downloads, like you're seeing that your audience isn't growing or people aren't consistently tuning into your podcast episodes, this episode is for you. No more churning out this amazing content that your ideal listeners aren't getting to hear, all because the episode title isn't enticing, isn't motivating them to click. So there are 3 things that you need to consider when naming your podcast episodes. Now, first and foremost, you should already know what I'm going to say, and that is podcast SEO. I often see people name their podcast episode based on what they think or the overall focus of the episode topic without doing any keyword research first. And I know a lot of it is because they don't, understand SEO, or they're not even sure how to do keyword research, and so they don't even bother with it. The thing is that you have to do keyword research. Now, one thing I do and I teach my clients to do is to do keyword research before you ever hit record on your podcast episode. And this is for a few different reasons. One, yes, you want to incorporate those keywords into like your episode title, your episode description, your show notes, all of that. But also, even when you're recording the episode, saying those keywords, because Google does index audio content. And so if you're also saying those keywords, that's going to help your content to show up for those keywords when people are doing a Google search. Now, this is so important, the podcast SEO piece. It's so important that I have an entire training dedicated to podcast SEO and where to actually put these keywords inside of the Social Detox Accelerator. If you want the right people to find your podcast, you have to prioritize podcast SEO. Relying solely on social media to grow your podcast listenership is first and foremost a waste of time, and it's going to leave you frustrated. I talk about, Instagram all the time, and I'm going to continue to talk about it. The reality is that your content isn't being pushed out to all of your followers, but also people are just scrolling. A lot of people mindlessly scroll. And so they're not actually seeing your stories. They're not seeing your reels and, different clips from your podcast content. And so you're missing out on people getting, seeing this podcast content, listening to this podcast content and everything like that. Also, podcast SEO will continue to work for you weeks, months, and years after the episode has been published. I think I shared it in one of the podcast episodes I recently did, but I'm saying it again. I have started to update old podcast episodes. So like doing keyword research, updating the titles, updating the show notes, all of that. And just making those few changes has driven traffic to those old episodes. And I'm talking about episodes like I've only done probably 7 or 8 episodes so far. And so those are episodes that came out 2 years ago and they're getting traffic again. So that is how important podcast SEO is. You know, it's so important. It's like you don't want to just rely on, like I said, social media, but also you don't want to just rely on people hopefully finding your podcast in the podcast listening apps. You want to give yourself a greater advantage. And so you really need to prioritize that podcast SEO so that way when people are doing a Google search, your podcast also comes up. And so you can't ignore doing that keyword research, like when it comes to naming your podcast episodes too. You want to make sure your podcast episode titles actually has the words that your ideal listener is searching for related to your content, related to like your niche or area of expertise. So that way that episode, it comes up whether they're searching, the podcast listening apps or searching Google or wherever. Okay. The second thing you need to consider, and this is not even necessarily a consideration, this is just a rule to follow: clear over catchy. And I get it. You want to be creative and come up with this catchy podcast episode title, but clear wins over catchy every single time. Catchy, or sometimes, say clever podcast titles usually result in listener confusion. They will not be able to tell whether or not the episode is for them or contains content that they want or need. Potential listeners should be able to look at your podcast title and immediately know whether or not it's an episode for them. Now, this does not mean your podcast episodes need to be boring. You want your podcast episodes titles to be juicy. Okay, I like to call them juicy. Some people will say like sexy, but we want some juicy podcast episode titles. It's so funny. This is like a side note, but every morning before I take my son to school, I'll put some like Carmex on his lips. And we've like started this routine where I'll be like, okay, it's time for juicy lips. We want our lips to be juicy. I'm sorry, that made me think of that. Super random ADHD brain. I'm sorry, please bear with me. You want your podcast episode titles to be juicy. You want it to create interest and intrigue. You want to make someone want to click and find out more, or make someone immediately know that that podcast episode has the answer to the question they have been searching for answers to. Okay? You want to make it so good where people are like, oh my gosh, yes, I need to listen to this. And like, think about like, if you're listening to this podcast, I know you are a avid podcast listener. So think about the podcast that you listen to and think about the titles. Like, which ones where you like look at it and like, oh, I need to listen to this right now. Like some of the podcasts that I follow, I can think of like when I see, a new podcast from them has just gone live. I look at the title, I'm like, ooh, I've been wanting to know the answer to this. Let me go listen to this right now. Because it's super clear. Like, I know what this episode is going to be about. Like, I'm not confused. I'm not like sitting there thinking like, wait, what is this about? Like, what does this mean? Is this something that even pertains to me? No, I clearly know that that is an episode that I want to listen to. And so I set aside the time to listen to it because it has an answer to something I've been wondering about, that I've been having questions about and whatnot. So you want to really kind of think about it through that lens. Like, okay, what question is my ideal listener, asking, and that I have the answer to? And how can I show them in this episode title that, hey, this is a question you have, and this podcast episode is going to answer that question. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next point, which is keep your ideal listener in mind. At the end of the day, you aren't creating this podcast for you. You are creating it for your listeners. And so you need to keep your listeners in mind, even when you are naming your podcast episodes. So most likely, your podcast content is what your listeners are looking for, but because of the title, they don't realize it is for them. So the other thing you want to make sure is that you are keeping your ideal listener in mind when you are naming your podcast episodes. This is something that has come up on a couple of the kickoff calls that I've been doing for the Social Detox Accelerator. And what I've been telling the ladies inside the accelerator is to think about, what question is your ideal listener asking that you have the answer to? Your podcast episode titles should scream, hey, this is the answer to that specific question you have. Now, this ties back into the whole podcast SEO piece. People are searching specific questions that you have the answer to. Think about how you use Google. You're usually typing in a question that you have because you're looking for an answer. So people are searching specific questions that you have the answer to. They are Googling the answer to the question because they don't know what the answer is. And I'm not saying this in a way to be like condescending or anything like that. I think sometimes that, and I do it myself, we get so hyper focused or so caught up in our heads about something or things like we've been doing this, we know this stuff. And so we think that something that should be like that's super basic or easy for us is the same for others. When in reality, no, like our people want to learn from us. Our people have these questions. And so we have to phrase things in a way that meets them where they're at. Hopefully that makes sense. Like I'm not trying to be like condescending or anything like that, but I am guilty of this myself too. And so I have to sometimes take a step back and put myself in my ideal person's shoes. Like, okay, what are they thinking? How are they viewing this? What questions are they possibly asking related to this specific problem? And so it's like just getting in the head of your ideal listener. Again, they are Googling the question. So you want your episode titles to, in a sense, mention the question and show that the episode contains the answer. Like that is probably the easiest formula that I have found that works really, really well when it comes to like titling your podcast episodes. It's incorporating that question that they're asking and showing that that episode has the answer to it. So when you focus on podcast SEO, choosing clear episode titles over catchy ones, and keeping your ideal listener in mind as you plan your podcast episode titles, and this is just with your content in general, you will boost your visibility and attract your ideal listeners, aka your dream clients. Inside the Social Detox Accelerator, I teach you how to do keyword research, where to incorporate those keywords so that you can boost your visibility, and how to create podcast content that attracts, nurtures, and converts. Like your podcast can literally be your lead gen and your nurturing and conversion platform. That is how I use my podcast. That is how I'm teaching the mamas inside of the Social Detox Accelerator how to use their podcasts. People will say all kind of crazy stuff when it comes to podcasting. Oh, it's a super long game. Oh, you can't actually sign clients from your podcast. You can only build community, blah, blah, blah. No, I am telling you, I have time and time and time again signed the dreamiest clients from this podcast. I have met the most incredible people who work with me from this podcast. It does not have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be just this other thing that you have. It literally can be a pivotal part of your business. It can literally bring in new leads, nurture and convert people into your offers. And the best part, it's evergreen. Like I said this on a podcast before, like anytime I see a spike in downloads, I know that within 2 to 4 weeks, I am signing somebody from this podcast as a client. And I have things in place where I'm able to actually track that. Like I know, like I literally can see, okay, they started listening to the podcast. Oh, they joined my email list. Oh, they followed me on Instagram and Threads. I can see where they're going. I can see their customer journey, like literally where they're moving to. And you can do that too. That creates predictability in your business. And that's what we need as mamas. We don't have all the time to be just doing all the things and hoping for the best. No, we need predictable and sustainable. And that is what you can have too. Now, all spots have been claimed for the first round of the Social Detox Accelerator, which I am so excited about this first group of amazing women that I get to support. But applications are open for the second round, which starts April 2025. You can submit your application now and literally have the accelerator paid off before it starts in April, whether you choose to pay in full or do the 3 or 6 month payment plan options. If you seriously want to make your podcast and email your main marketing platforms and really create more predictability in your sales, this is the program for you. Like point blank, period. That is what we're doing inside of the accelerator. So to learn more and submit your application, head to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/social detox. All right, mama, that is it for this episode. I will catch you in the next one. Well, mama, that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to hang with me. If you enjoyed today's episode, will you do me a favor and follow the podcast and leave a review? Hitting that follow button and sharing your thoughts about the podcast are the best ways to ensure that other mamas like you find this show. Your review also lets me know if you're enjoying this podcast, so make sure to share your thoughts before you go. All right, mama, I'll catch you in the next episode.